Having seized the throne of England in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, King Henry VII had effectively ended the Wars of the Roses through his marriage to Elizabeth of York, thus uniting the two warring houses of Lancaster and York. However, the nature of his rule and of his own tenuous claim to the throne through the debarred Beaufort line meant that he was continually open to challenges to his rule. Indeed, Henry himself was a brilliant recent exemplar of how to seize the throne, given his own rule was based on the right of conquest. By 1497, Henry's policies and harsh financial demands required to fund his war against Scotland sparked the Cornish rebellions of the year. Henry was no stranger to rebellion, having put down a Yorkist resurgence 10 years before, which had grown up around a young boy named Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be the son of the late Richard III's elder deceased brother, George, the Duke of Clarence. The rebellion of 1497 had its origins in disagreements regarding the tin mining industry, which was centred in Cornwall. Henry acted by suspending the privileges and operations of the Cornish stannaries, which also involved removing the county's tax exemption privileges, which had originally been agreed long before, during the reign of King Edward I in the early 14th century. In addition to this, Henry had insisted upon a forced loan, as well as heavy taxation to fund his efforts against imminent invasions from Scotland and from another pretender to his throne by the name of Perkin Warbeck. This added burden, particularly the forced loan, disproportionately fell harder on the Cornish, thus inciting rebellion. In Cornwall, the rebellion was cast as petitionary in nature rather than any grand ambition to remove Henry Tudor himself. The initial target of the rebels' wrath was naturally the local tax collector, before their attention fell upon Henry's chief financial lieutenants, Cardinal John Morton and Sir Reginald Bray, the Lord Chancellor and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, respectively. The leaders of the revolt were a local blacksmith, Michael Joseph, and a lawyer, Thomas Flamanck. The rebel ranks swelled to around 15,000 as they left their native county, picking up some support as they marched through neighbouring Devon. Devon itself had previously accepted regulations 3 years before, which effectively circumvented the penalties now inflicted on their Cornish neighbours. While traversing Somerset, the rebels finally got their hands on a hated tax collector, reportedly killing one of Henry's commissioners at Taunton. At Wells, the rebel army received a decided boost with the arrival of James Touchet, a noble who eagerly joined and was proclaimed their leader. Given Touchet was a man of noble rank and had valued military experience, he was well received as he led them on towards London. For Henry, the timing could not have been worse, given he was preparing for the war in Scotland to counter the Pretender and his northern supporters. Since February, the king had wholly devoted his attention there, sending money to York, Durham, Newcastle and Berwick. Up to this point, the rebels had seen little in response from Henry himself. This has often been chalked down to strategy, the king luring the rebels deep into unfriendly territory and far from support. Perhaps, but a simpler explanation is more likely to be that the king was simply blindsided by events in the southwest. Nonetheless, he did order his men under the Lord Daubeny south to take on the Cornish, while the Earl of Surrey remained north to deter the Scots. The city of London initially panicked at the proximity of the rebel force, the 15,000 or so strong army encamped at Farnham near Guildford. Meanwhile, Daubeny had camped his army at Hounslow Heath on the 13th of June, his presence stiffening the resolve of the capital. It was near Guildford that a royal detachment skirmished with the Cornishmen. Such a check exacerbated rebel desertions. Instead of approaching the capital directly, they decided to march from the south, close to Kent, where Flamanck was convinced they would gain substantial support. In the event, they were very wrong, with some Kentishmen under their Earl actually mobilising against them. What was worse, King Henry had by now assembled a large overall force to combat them, while the rebels grimly awaited their fate on Blackheath, almost within a stone's throw away of London itself. With such dark circumstances, many rebels simply fled the camp. Daubigny also received messages from some offering to betray their leaders in exchange for pardon at St George's in the Fields. On Friday the 16th of June, all the pieces were in place, with the rebels reaching their final position as aforementioned, and the Royal Army awaiting the battle with the coming of day. The rebels spent the evening discordant, with many arguing for a last-minute appeal for mercy. However, the Smith, it was said, was of a contrary mind. Despite Joseph's stalwart courage, morning revealed a diminishment of rebel numbers from 15 to 10,000 men, armed mostly with bows, bills and staves, and with no mounted or artillery support. The battle was a simple triple attack on front, flank and rear, though the main thrust of the attack came from Lord Daubigny himself, who commanded the greatest of Henry's battles. He led his troops along the main road, attacking the Cornish via the Deptford bridge. With the bridge cleared, Daubigny did not hesitate to boldly lead the attack into the thick of the rebels. A loyal subject and an experienced soldier, it was said that the king himself had criticised or had taxed him with remissness, given the rebels' position so close to London. So the cause of the Baron's ferocity and eagerness to crush the Cornishmen may have been no mystery to those closest to him. He was even temporarily captured, though he was subsequently released. Perhaps given the rebels' hopeless situation, their main priorities were to mitigate any reprisals meted out by the king, and hurting or killing his chief lieutenant was not the best way to do this. By this point too, Daubigny's capture was most likely irrelevant anyway, given the general tide of battle. Having been surrounded, the rebels fought desperately, killing relatively few of the loyalists, mostly piercing them with yard-long arrows. However, eventually they were routed, with losses at anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 men. King Henry himself had not engaged directly, remaining at the rear. He returned triumphantly back into the city via the London Bridge, but the fate of the rebel leaders was not so bright. Michael Joseph, likely the boldest of the trio, managed to initially evade capture but was picked up later on. Ultimately, all three were taken, and on the 27th of June, both Joseph and Flamanque were drawn through London and hung at Tyburn. Joseph remained brave to his end, aspiring for a name perpetual and a fame permanent and immortal. Audley was beheaded on Tower Hill the next day. The heads of the three chief traitors set upon London Bridge as grisly symbols of the king's vengeance. As for the rank and file rebel survivors, the king spared them. So ended the first Cornish rebellion, though trouble would flare up once more just a few months later when the pretender Perkin Warbeck would finally invade, choosing the recently disgruntled Cornish land as his base. This too would eventually be crushed, and despite these uprisings and plots, Henry Tudor would retain the throne until his death in 1509.